can I help you translate that?" The words sliced through boardroom silence. Augustus Fairmont's fingers tightened around his Mont Blanc pen. 44-years-old Navy suit accustomed to controlling every conversation. The Japanese executives had been struggling with English for 10 minutes. His company's biggest deal hung in the balance. Then she spoke. Ophelia Storm stood beside their table in simple black uniform. 32 dark skin, absorbing the restaurant's golden light. Her voice carried authority that belonged nowhere near service posture, suggesting secrets that made Augustus's chest tighten. Crystal stemware caught Manhattan's evening glow. Power dressed itself in expensive suits. But watching this woman command attention with a single question, Augustus sensed ground shifting beneath assumptions he'd never examined. Something about her eyes suggested she held keys to doors he didn't know existed. The voice belonged to someone Augustus had never truly seen before, though she had served his table 3 times in the past month. Ophelia Storm stood beside their table with the same quiet presence she always carried. But something had shifted in the air around her. Her dark skin seemed to absorb the restaurant's warm lighting, while her eyes, intelligent, steady, held a depth that suddenly made Augustus question every assumption he had never realized he was making. "I speak Japanese," she said simply, her words directed to the struggling businessman, whose frustrated gestures had grown increasingly apologetic. Without waiting for permission, she began speaking in fluid, natural Japanese, her pronunciation carrying the subtle regional inflections that spoke of serious study, not casual learning. The transformation was immediate. The Japanese executive's shoulders relaxed as complex technical terms flowed between them with the ease of old friends discussing the weather. Augustus watched fascinated despite himself as Ophelia navigated not just the language, but the cultural nuances, the proper levels of formality, the respectful pauses, the delicate way she indicated when clarification was needed, without causing embarrassment. "He's explaining that the implementation timeline isn't just about technical readiness," she said, turning back to Augustus with the same calm professionalism she used when taking his coffee order. "It's about ensuring the cultural adaptation phase doesn't compromise the user experience in markets where technology adoption patterns differ significantly from Western expectations." The words hung in the air like a revelation wrapped in impossibility. Augustus had spent the last 20 minutes trying to decode exactly this concept, watching his potential partnership strain under the weight of miscommunication. Now, this woman, this waitress, who he had barely acknowledged beyond polite nods, had unlocked the conversation with surgical precision. "How did you?" Augustus began, but stopped himself. The question felt too revealing, too much like admitting he had categorized her so completely that her competence came as a shock. Ophelia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A recognition of his recognition, perhaps. She continued translating as the Japanese executive launched into a more detailed explanation, her hands moving in small, precise gestures that complemented her words. She switched between languages with the unconscious ease of someone for whom multilingual thinking was as natural as breathing. When the executive mentioned something in rapid Japanese, Ophelia nodded and turned to address a third member of Augustus's team who had been silent throughout the evening. "He's referencing a case study from the European market expansion. Would you like me to ask him to elaborate on the specific metrics?" The team member, a usually confident director who commanded rooms with his presence, simply nodded, apparently too stunned to form words. Augustus understood the feeling. It wasn't just the languages, though, that was remarkable enough. It was the way she grasped the underlying business concepts, the strategic implications, the cultural subtleties that even his highly paid consultants sometimes missed. As the conversation continued through Ophelia's translation, Augustus found himself studying her face. There was no pride in her expression, no sense that she was performing or seeking recognition. She approached the task with the same understated competence she brought to remembering that he preferred his coffee black and his meetings undisturbed. But underneath that professional calm, he sensed something else, a careful control that spoke of deeper currents beneath still waters. The Japanese executive reached into his briefcase and produced a document speaking rapidly as he pointed to specific sections. Ophelia listened intently, occasionally, asking brief clarifying questions that demonstrated she understood not just the words, but the technical concepts behind them. He has implementation data from a similar project in South Korea, she explained to Augustus. The cultural adaptation protocols they developed there might be directly applicable to your target demographics. He's asking if your team would be interested in a detailed breakdown of their methodology. Augustus nodded, though his attention was divided between the business opportunity and the growing puzzle of the woman facilitating it. When she spoke Japanese, her entire posture shifted slightly. More formal, more deferential, in the way that reflected cultural understanding, rather than subservience. When she turned back to English, she resumed the quiet confidence he was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Ophelia serving as more than a translator. She became a cultural bridge, helping both sides navigate not just language barriers, but the subtle differences in business communication styles. She never overstepped, never inserted her own opinions, but her questions revealed a sophistication that made Augustus increasingly uncomfortable with his own preconceptions. As the Japanese team prepared to leave, they bowed formally to Ophelia, speaking in rapid, grateful Japanese. She responded with equal formality, but Augustus caught something in her expression, a fleeting moment, where her professional mask slipped just enough to reveal what might have been weariness, or perhaps resignation. After they departed, the dining room seemed to contract back to its normal size. The other members of Augustus's team were already pulling out their phones, eager to process what had just happened and how it would affect their negotiations. But Augustus remained seated watching as Ophelia began clearing the table with the same methodical efficiency she had brought to everything else. "That was—" he started, then stopped. Impressive seemed inadequate. Surprising felt insulting. Remarkable suggested he had a right to be surprised by her competence. She looked up from stacking the empty water glasses, her expression politely attentive. "Will there be anything else this evening, Mr. Fairmont?" The formal distance in her voice struck him as intentional, a gentle reminder of the boundaries that had been temporarily suspended, but were now firmly back in place. Augustus found himself wanting to ask questions about her background, her education, how someone with her abilities had ended up serving tables in a Manhattan restaurant. But each potential question felt like it would reveal more about his own assumptions than about her story. "No," he said finally. "Thank you. For everything." She nodded once, professional and unreachable, then moved away to attend to other tables. Augustus watched her go, noting for the first time how she carried herself, not with the hurried deference he unconsciously expected from service staff, but with a quiet dignity that suggested she saw her current circumstances as temporary rather than defining. The evening's success should have left him energized, ready to capitalize on the breakthrough Ophelia had facilitated. Instead, he found himself unsettled by questions he couldn't quite formulate, disturbed by the realization that he had been seeing without truly observing hearing, without really listening. Outside, Manhattan's lights blurred past his car window, like stars falling upward into darkness. 3 days passed before Augustus found himself back at the restaurant, telling himself it was the proximity to his office that drew him there, not curiosity about a woman who translated complex business negotiations between courses. He chose a different table this time, one in Ophelia's section, but positioned where he could observe without appearing to study her. She moved through the dining room with the same measured grace he remembered, but now he noticed details that had escaped him before. The way she listened to each customer with complete attention, regardless of their order's complexity. How she never wrote anything down, yet never made mistakes. The subtle way she adjusted her communication style, more formal with the elderly banker in the corner, gently humorous with the young couple celebrating an anniversary. When she approached his table, her expression remained professionally neutral, but he caught something in her eyes that might have been amusement. "Good evening, Fairmont. Will you be dining alone tonight?" "Yes." He paused, then added, "Actually, I was hoping we might talk. After your shift, perhaps." She set down his water glass with deliberate precision. "About what specifically?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. He had expected polite deflection, maybe a gracious excuse about other commitments. Instead, she waited with the same patient attention she had given the Japanese executives, as if his request were simply another order to be filled or declined. "Your background," he said honestly. "What you did the other night. That wasn't the work of someone who picked up languages casually." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She let the silence stretch between them, not filling it with explanations or apologies. Augustus realized she was waiting for him to ask a real question, not dance around what he actually wanted to know. "You're overqualified for this job." "Most people are overqualified for their jobs, Mr. Fairmont. The question is whether they have better options." Her words carried no bitterness, just the matter-of-fact observation of someone who had made peace with uncomfortable truths. But underneath the calm delivery, Augustus sensed layers of meaning he wasn't qualified to interpret. "I'll be here until 11, she said finally. "If you're still interested in that conversation, I take my break at 10:30. She moved away before he could respond, leaving him to contemplate an hour and a half of dinner theater, while more substantial questions simmered beneath the surface of small talk and wine selections. Augustus found himself studying other diners, wondering what stories lived behind their public presentations. The businessman at table 12 might be 3 months from bankruptcy. The woman celebrating her promotion could be hiding the fact that she earned it by staying silent about her supervisor's harassment. Everyone performing their assigned roles, while their real lives remained carefully hidden. When 10:30 arrived, Ophelia appeared beside his table without fanfare. She had changed from her uniform into dark jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made her seem more present, less like part of the restaurant's carefully curated atmosphere. "There's a coffee shop around the corner," she said. "Quieter than here." The transition from the restaurant's controlled elegance to the coffee shop's democratic chaos felt symbolic in ways Augustus couldn't quite articulate. Students hunched over laptops, couples shared desserts. Elderly men played chess in the corner. Ophelia chose a table near the window, where the streetlight painted everything in amber tones. "So," she said once they were seated, "what would you like to know? Start with the languages. How many do you speak? Fluently 5. Conversationally, 3 more. She stirred her coffee slowly, a small ritual that seemed to give her time to choose her words. Japanese, French, Spanish, Mandarin, plus English. Some German, Portuguese, and Arabic, though I'm rusty with those. That's doctoral-level competency. It was, once. The admission hung between them like a door left half open. Augustus waited, sensing that pushing would only cause it to close completely. "Princeton," she said eventually. "Comparative linguistics with a focus on cultural communication patterns. I specialized in how language structures reflect and reinforce social hierarchies." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. What happened? For the first time since they had sat down, Ophelia's composure flickered. Not with emotion exactly, but with the careful consideration of someone deciding how much truth a conversation could bear. "I was good at my job. Very good. I worked as a simultaneous interpreter for the United Nations Corporate Negotiations Diplomatic Conferences, the kind of work where precision matters and mistakes have consequences." She paused, watching pedestrians pass by the window. A young woman hurried past, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly at someone who couldn't see her. An older man walked his dog with the patient dedication of someone for whom the evening ritual was a form of meditation. There was an incident, Ophelia continued. A high-profile negotiation where I was interpreting for an African delegation. The details don't matter, but afterward, there were allegations that I had introduced bias into the translation, that I had allowed my personal opinions to influence my professional judgment. Had you? No. The word came without hesitation or defensiveness. But the accusation was enough. In my field, reputation is everything. Once doubt exists about an interpreter's neutrality, the trust necessary for the work disappears. Augustus found himself leaning forward. Who made the allegations? Someone with more credibility than I had. Someone whose word carried more weight in rooms where decisions get made. The careful way she phrased it told Augustus everything he needed to know about power dynamics and whose voices mattered when stories conflicted. So you started over. I survived. She met his eyes directly. There's a difference. The distinction felt important, though Augustus wasn't sure he fully understood it yet. He sensed they were approaching something fragile, a trust that could be damaged by the wrong response or careless assumption. Why are you telling me this? Ophelia considered the question with the same thoughtfulness she brought to everything else. Because you asked, and because most people in your position never do. My position, wealthy, white, male, used to having doors open before you reach them. She delivered the assessment without malice, as if she were describing the weather. People like you usually don't wonder about the stories behind people like me. The observation stung because it was accurate. Augustus tried to remember the last time he had asked a service worker about their background, their aspirations, their reasons for being where they were. The exercise was uncomfortable. I'd like to know more, he said. About what happened. About you. Why? The question felt like a test, and Augustus realized his answer mattered more than he had initially understood. This wasn't idle curiosity or guilt-driven interest. Something about Ophelia's story had opened a door in his own understanding that he couldn't simply close again. Because I think I've been sleepwalking, he said finally. And meeting you was the alarm clock I didn't know I needed. And for the first time that evening, Ophelia smiled, not the professional courtesy she deployed at work, but something genuine and complicated. That's a start, she said. Outside, the city continued its relentless motion, millions of stories intersecting and diverging, like streams finding their way to the same ocean. The following weeks established a pattern neither of them named. Augustus would arrive at the restaurant, conduct his business, and linger until Ophelia's shift ended. Their conversations migrated from the coffee shop to park benches to quiet corners of bookstores, where the weight of her story could unfold without the pressure of public scrutiny. It was during one of these evening walks through Central Park that Ophelia finally spoke about the negotiation that had destroyed her career. The setting felt appropriate, trees casting long shadows in the dying light. The city's noise reduced to a distant hum that couldn't intrude on difficult truths. It was a trade agreement. She said, her voice steady, despite the gravity of what she was sharing. Agricultural subsidies and mineral rights between the U.S. and 3 West African nations. 6 months of preliminary talks, then a final week where everything would be decided. Augustus had been part of similar negotiations, though from the corporate side, where the stakes felt abstract, measured in profit margins rather than national sovereignty. He understood the delicate choreography of international diplomacy, how a single misinterpreted phrase could derail months of careful progress. The African delegation's chief negotiator was brilliant, Ophelia continued. Dr. Amara Keita from Senegal. She spoke 5 languages herself, but protocol required official interpretation for the record. When she argued that the proposed subsidy structure would perpetuate colonial economic patterns, I translated her words exactly. They paused beside the reservoir, where joggers traced their evening circuits, each runner lost in private rhythms of effort and endurance. Augustus waited, sensing that the crucial details lay in what Ophelia hadn't yet said. The American trade representative was Richard Blackwell. You probably know the name. He's testified before Congress, appears on financial news programs. During a break, he approached me privately and suggested that Dr. Keita's arguments were becoming inflammatory. He implied that as an American citizen, I had certain loyalties that should inform my professional judgment. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, its implications spreading slowly through Augustus's understanding. He had met Richard Blackwell at industry conferences, had shaken his hand at charity galas. The man was respected, connected, the kind of Washington insider whose phone calls got returned immediately. I told him that my job was to translate accurately, not to edit based on political preference. He smiled and said he appreciated my dedication to principle, but that principle sometimes needed to be balanced with pragmatism. Ophelia's pace had slowed as she spoke, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had relived this conversation countless times. Augustus found himself studying her profile, looking for signs of the pain that such betrayal must have caused. The next day, Dr. Keita presented the delegation's final position. It was firm but fair. They were willing to accept modified terms if certain protections for local farmers were guaranteed. When I translated her statement, I was careful to preserve both her diplomatic language and her underlying resolve. They had reached a secluded area where old oak trees created a natural amphitheater. Ophelia sat on a bench facing the water, and Augustus joined her, leaving space between them while staying close enough to hear every word. 3 hours later, Blackwell's team released a statement claiming that the African delegation had become unreasonable and inflammatory in their demands. They said the breakdown in negotiations resulted from cultural misunderstandings that couldn't be bridged. The agreement collapsed. Augustus felt a cold understanding settling in his chest. They blamed you. Not directly, not at first, but within a week there were whispers in diplomatic circles that the interpreter had introduced bias into the translations. That emotional involvement with the African position had compromised professional neutrality. Blackwell's people were very careful. They never made formal accusations, just raised concerned questions about the interpretation process. The careful destruction of a reputation through innuendo and suggestion struck Augustus as particularly cruel. No direct confrontation that could be defended against just the slow poison of doubt spreading through professional networks. I requested a formal review of the translation records. Everything was there. My words matched Dr. Keita's statements exactly. But by then, the narrative had taken hold. Questions about interpreter bias became assumptions about compromised judgment. Job offers disappeared. Contracts weren't renewed. Ophelia's voice remained level throughout her account, but Augustus caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the effort this composure required. He found himself angry on her behalf, though he recognized that his anger was safe and useless compared to the systematic dismantling she had endured. Why didn't you fight it publicly, I mean? Expose what really happened. With what resources, against whom? She turned to look at him directly. Richard Blackwell has powerful friends and unlimited legal funding. I was a freelance interpreter with a graduate degree and good intentions. The mathematics of that conflict aren't difficult to calculate. The pragmatic assessment stung because it was accurate. Augustus had seen similar calculations play out in corporate settings, not around race necessarily, but around power and access, and whose version of events would be believed when stories conflicted. So you started over. I tried to. Other cities, different specializations. But my field is small, and networks overlap. The questions followed me. Eventually, I realized I had two choices. Keep fighting a battle. I couldn't win or find a different way to survive. The word survive resonated with earlier conversations, carrying weight that went beyond simple economic necessity. Augustus was beginning to understand that Ophelia's current circumstances weren't just about finding employment. They were about maintaining dignity while navigating a world that had decided she was expendable. "That was 2 years ago," she said. "The restaurant job pays enough to cover rent and groceries. It's honest work with clear expectations. No one questions my qualifications or my motivations when I'm refilling water glasses." The resignation in her voice was worse than anger would have been. Anger suggested the possibility of fight. Resignation implied a peace made with injustice that couldn't be overcome. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the sky darken over the water. Augustus felt the inadequacy of any response he might offer. Sympathy seemed insulting, solutions presumptuous. The scope of what had been taken from Ophelia, not just her career, but her faith in the systems she had served, defied easy comfort. "I keep thinking about something you said," Augustus finally offered. "About language reflecting social hierarchies. It seems like you experienced that theory in the worst possible way." "I did, though I prefer to think of it as education rather than experience. Most people never see how power actually operates. They just benefit from it, or suffer under it, without understanding the mechanisms. I got a very detailed lesson in how narratives get constructed and whose voices matter when truth becomes inconvenient." The clinical analysis struck Augustus as both impressive and heartbreaking. Ophelia had transformed personal trauma into intellectual understanding. But at what cost? How much of herself had she been forced to sacrifice to achieve such detached clarity? "Does it ever make you angry?" he asked. "Every day." The admission came without hesitation. "But anger is a luxury I can't afford. It interferes with the work of rebuilding." The word rebuilding suggested hope, though Augustus wasn't sure what form that reconstruction might take. As they walked back toward the streetlights and the familiar chaos of the city he found himself carrying, questions that extended far beyond Ophelia's personal story. How many other talented people had been quietly discarded by systems that valued conformity over competence? How many voices had been silenced, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the slow erosion of professional opportunities? How complicit had he been, through action or inaction, in maintaining structures that rewarded people like him while punishing people like her? The questions followed him home through empty streets that suddenly seemed full of invisible stories he had never thought to notice. The revelation of Ophelia's past had shifted something fundamental in Augustus's perspective, like adjusting the focus on a lens he hadn't realized was blurred. The following Monday, he found himself noticing things at his company that had always been present but somehow invisible. The demographics of his executive meetings, the way certain voices carried more weight in conference rooms, the unspoken assumptions that guided hiring decisions. His assistant Maria had worked for the company for 8 years. She spoke 3 languages and had a degree in international business, yet she had never been considered for any position beyond administrative support. His head of diversity initiatives was a white woman who spoke eloquently about inclusion, while the actual diversity in leadership positions remained statistically insignificant. These observations accumulated throughout the week like pressure behind a dam until Friday evening, when Augustus found himself across from Ophelia in their usual coffee shop, struggling to articulate questions he was only beginning to understand how to ask. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, stirring his coffee with unnecessary attention to the task, "about learning to see systems instead of just individual failures." Ophelia nodded, waiting for him to find his way to the actual question. "How do you distinguish between genuine change and well-intentioned ignorance?" The question seemed to amuse her, though not unkindly. "You want to know if your sudden awareness makes you different from other people who feel bad about inequality, but don't actually do anything about it." Her directness was both uncomfortable and refreshing. Augustus had spent decades in environments where difficult truths were wrapped in diplomatic language, where confrontation was softened by careful phrasing and strategic ambiguity. Ophelia's willingness to name things directly felt like a form of respect he wasn't sure he had earned. Something like that. "The difference isn't in feeling bad," she said. "It's in what you do with the discomfort. Most people try to resolve it by finding explanations that preserve their worldview. They decide that individual success stories prove the system works, that their own achievements justify their advantages, that people who struggle must have failed to work hard enough. Augustus recognized himself in that description, though the recognition stung. How many times had he attributed his success to merit, while dismissing others' failures as character flaws? How often had he cited diversity statistics as evidence of progress, while ignoring the lived experiences behind those numbers? So what's the alternative? Learning to listen, Ophelia said simply. Not just to words, but to what creates the need for those words to be spoken. She leaned back in her chair, considering how to explain something that seemed both obvious and impossibly complex. Around them, the coffee shop maintained its evening rhythm. Students cramming for exams, couples negotiating weekend plans, solitary figures reading books or staring at laptop screens. When I translate, she continued, I'm not just converting words from one language to another. I'm bridging different ways of understanding the world. A Japanese businessman doesn't just speak differently than an American. He thinks differently about hierarchy, about directness, about the relationship between individual and group identity. Augustus found himself leaning forward, recognizing that this was more than casual conversation. The challenge isn't technical fluency. It's developing enough cultural competence to preserve meaning across different frameworks of understanding. You have to learn to hear not just what people are saying, but why they're saying it that way. What assumptions they're working from what they need you to understand. The parallel to their own relationship wasn't subtle, and Augustus suspected it wasn't accidental. So when you listen to me talking about suddenly noticing inequality, I hear someone who's discovering that the world he thought he understood was actually just the world, as seen from his particular position within it. She smiled at his expression. It's not a criticism. It's just observation. Most people never get that opportunity, and many who do refuse to take it. Augustus felt himself standing at some kind of crossroads, though he couldn't see clearly where the different paths might lead. The safe route was obvious. Acknowledge the lesson, express appropriate concern. Maybe write a check to a relevant charity and return to life as usual. The alternative felt undefined and potentially threatening to everything he had built his identity around. What would real change look like, he asked. For you personally or in general? Both. Ophelia considered this while watching a young father outside the window, patiently teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle. The girl kept oversteering, then overcorrecting, finding her balance for brief moments before wobbling back toward uncertainty. Personally, it would mean accepting that your success isn't just the result of your individual merit. That doesn't diminish what you've accomplished, but it puts it in context. You've worked hard, but you've also benefited from advantages that weren't available to everyone. The assessment felt both fair and difficult to fully accept. Augustus had worked hard, countless late-night strategic risks decisions that could have destroyed his career if they had gone wrong. But he was beginning to understand that hard work existed within systems that determined whose efforts got rewarded and whose got overlooked. And in general, power sharing, not just symbolic representation, but actual redistribution of decision-making authority, hiring people like me, not despite our experiences with systemic barriers, but because those experiences provide insight that people who've never faced those barriers can't possess. The conversation was interrupted by Augustus's phone buzzing with a text from his head of operations about a Monday morning board meeting. The message pulled him back into his familiar world of quarterly projections and strategic initiatives. But the transition felt jarring now, like switching between languages that organized reality differently. I should probably head home, he said, though he found himself reluctant to end the conversation. Of course. Ophelia began gathering her things with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to adapting to other people's schedules. As they walked toward the subway entrance, Augustus found himself thinking about the bicycle lesson they had observed. The father hadn't criticized his daughter's mistakes or told her to try harder. Instead, he had run alongside her, providing support when she needed it, and stepping back when she found her balance. The teaching had been patient, continuous, responsive to her actual needs rather than his assumptions about what she should be able to do. "Ophelia," he said as they reached the place where their routes diverged, "would you be interested in consulting for my company? Not as a translator, but as someone who could help us understand what we're not seeing." She studied his face with the same careful attention she brought to complex translations. "That's a generous offer. What makes you think your board would accept advice from someone who serves their coffee?" The question exposed assumptions he was still learning to recognize. His enthusiasm for change existed within structures that might not share his newfound perspective. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out." "Then let's start there," she said, with not knowing, but being willing to find out. Then as Augustus descended into the subway, he carried with him the sense that he was learning a new language, one where the familiar words meant different things, where questions mattered more than answers, where listening required skills he was only beginning to develop. The train car was full of people returning home from their various forms of work, each carrying stories he would never hear, but could no longer pretend didn't exist. The Monday morning board meeting began like countless others. Polished mahogany reflecting artificial light. Coffee served in bone china cups, quarterly reports distributed with military precision. Augustus had attended these gatherings for years without questioning their choreography. But now he found himself noticing who spoke first, whose ideas received immediate consideration, whose suggestions required additional validation. He waited until the formal agenda concluded before introducing what he privately thought of as his proposal, though he recognized it was more accurately a confession disguised as a business strategy. "I want to discuss our diversity initiatives," he said, watching 12 faces arrange themselves into expressions of polite attention. "Specifically, I think we need to acknowledge that our current approach isn't producing meaningful change." Board member Catherine Walsh, a woman whose silver hair and crisp suits commanded respect in rooms like this one, leaned forward with interest. "What kind of change are you envisioning, Augustus? Bringing in external perspective, someone who can help us identify blind spots in our hiring and promotion practices. I have a candidate in mind, someone with extensive experience in cross-cultural communication and organizational dynamics." He had rehearsed this pitch carefully, emphasizing qualifications, while avoiding details that might trigger premature judgments. But even his diplomatic phrasing couldn't prevent the subtle shift in atmosphere that occurred when board members began translating diversity initiatives into implications for their comfortable world. "That sounds reasonable in principle," said Thomas Meridian, whose family name appeared on several buildings downtown. "What's this consultant's background?" Augustus felt the weight of Ophelia's story pressing against his carefully prepared words. PhD in linguistics from Princeton, extensive experience in high-stakes international negotiations, fluent in multiple languages. Currently underemployed due to circumstances beyond her control. Her. The question came from James Rutherford, spoken with the particular emphasis that suggested gender was somehow relevant to competence. "Yes, Dr. Ophelia Storm. She's been working as..." "Storm." Meridian interrupted his tone, shifting almost imperceptibly. "Unusual name. What's her ethnic background?" The question hung in the air like smoke, its implications spreading through the room's careful politeness. Augustus felt his prepared arguments rearranging themselves as he realized he was no longer discussing qualifications, but navigating coded language about who belonged in rooms like this one. "She's African American," he said simply, "and the most intellectually capable person I've encountered in years." The silence that followed felt deliberate, a space where unspoken assessments could be made without the inconvenience of explicit statements. Walsh finally broke it with the kind of measured response that sounded supportive while committing to nothing. Diversity of perspective is certainly valuable, Augustus, but we should be careful about appearing to make decisions based on demographics rather than merit. Yet the irony of the statement delivered in a room where 12 of 13 board members shared the same demographic profile wasn't lost on Augustus, though he suspected it was invisible to most of his colleagues. "I'm not suggesting we hire her because she's black," he said, choosing directness over diplomacy. "I'm suggesting we hire her because she's brilliant, and because her experience with systemic exclusion gives her insights we don't possess." The word systemic seemed to activate something in the room's defensive mechanisms. Rutherford shuffled his papers with unnecessary attention, while Meridian's expression settled into the patient tolerance usually reserved for idealistic but misguided presentations. "What specific insights are you referring to?" asked Dr. Helen Clark, the board's lone woman besides Walsh, though her tone suggested skepticism rather than curiosity. Augustus found himself thinking about Ophelia's careful explanations of translation as cultural bridge building, her analysis of how power operated through seemingly neutral processes. But translating those concepts for an audience that might not want to understand them felt like an impossible task. "She can help us see why our diversity recruitment efforts produce applications, but not hires why our mentorship programs don't lead to leadership advancement for participants, why our company culture feels inclusive to us, but exclusive to others. Those are significant claims," Meridian observed. "What makes you confident she can deliver on them?" The question was fair, but Augustus sensed it was also tactical, a way of demanding proof for assertions that couldn't be proven without the very trust that was being withheld. "I've spent considerable time discussing these issues with her. Her analysis of organizational dynamics is more sophisticated than most of the consultants we've hired for similar purposes." "How much time?" The question came from Walsh, and something in her tone suggested it mattered for reasons beyond professional evaluation. Augustus felt the conversation shifting into territory he hadn't anticipated, where his personal interest in Ophelia became subject to board scrutiny. The implication was subtle but unmistakable that his judgment might be compromised by factors unrelated to business considerations. "Enough to recognize her qualifications," he said carefully. "Of course," Walsh replied, her smile carrying the particular warmth that often preceded difficult conversations. "But perhaps we should consider whether your enthusiasm for this candidate might be influencing your professional assessment." The suggestion hung between them like a challenge, though one wrapped in language too careful to constitute direct accusation. Augustus understood he was being offered an exit, a graceful way to withdraw his proposal, while preserving relationships that had taken years to build. Instead, he found himself thinking about Ophelia's description of Richard Blackwell's careful destruction of her reputation, how power operated through implication and suggestion rather than direct confrontation. "My enthusiasm is based on her qualifications and our need for the perspective she can provide," he said firmly. "I think we should move forward with a formal consultation." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees, though no one had adjusted the thermostat. Augustus watched his colleagues exchange glances that communicated volumes about his newfound unreasonableness and the regrettable necessity of managing his misguided priorities. "Perhaps we should table this discussion," Meridian suggested, with the kind of paternal concern usually reserved for family members making poor life choices. "Give you some time to consider whether this is the right approach for achieving your diversity goals." The phrasing was masterful, positioning Augustus's proposal as impulsive rather than thoughtful, personal rather than professional, a temporary aberration that time and reflection would surely correct. As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations about safer topics, Augustus found himself isolated in a way that felt both familiar and completely new. He had disagreed with board decisions before, but always within acceptable parameters, always about issues that didn't challenge fundamental assumptions about how the world should work. Walking back to his office, he felt the weight of institutional pressure settling around him like gravity. Not dramatic or overtly hostile, just the persistent force of systems defending themselves against change. His phone buzzed with a text from Ophelia. How did it go? He stared at the screen for several minutes before typing his response. I'm learning what you meant about the mathematics of conflict. Her reply came quickly. Welcome to the advanced course. The week following the board meeting felt like navigating a minefield disguised as normal business operations. Augustus noticed the shift immediately. Conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. Invitations to informal gatherings that somehow failed to reach him. The particular politeness that served as a warning system among people who exercised power through consensus rather than confrontation. By Thursday, the subtle pressure had crystallized into a lunch meeting with Catherine Walsh at her usual table at Le Bernardin, where the city's power brokers conducted their most delicate negotiations over carefully prepared seafood and wines that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Augustus, she began. After the waiter had taken their orders, I'm concerned about you. The phrasing was perfect personal rather than professional, caring rather than accusatory. Walsh had built her reputation on the ability to deliver difficult messages wrapped in maternal concern, making resistance feel like ingratitude. I appreciate that, Catherine. What specifically worries you? This diversity consultant proposal. It feels uncharacteristic. You've always been pragmatic about these issues, focused on sustainable progress rather than dramatic gestures. Augustus recognized the compliment embedded in the criticism, his previous pragmatism positioned as wisdom, his current position as departure from sound judgment. But months of conversations with Ophelia had taught him to listen for what wasn't being said alongside what was. I think sustainable progress requires understanding why our current efforts aren't working, he said carefully. Storm could help us identify obstacles we're not seeing. Dr. Storm. Walsh repeated the name with the slight emphasis that suggested skepticism about the title. You know, several board members have done some research on her background. The words hit Augustus like cold water. He had anticipated resistance, but not investigation had underestimated how threatened his colleagues might feel by the prospect of external scrutiny. And what did they discover? Nothing illegal, of course, but there are questions about her departure from the diplomatic circuit. Some suggestion that professional judgment issues were involved. Augustus felt his hands tighten around his water glass. Walsh's careful phrasing echoed Ophelia's description of how her reputation had been destroyed through suggestions and implications, rather than direct accusations, through the spread of doubt that was impossible to definitively refute. What kind of questions? The details aren't important, but you understand how these things work. Once questions exist about someone's judgment, it becomes difficult to recommend them for positions requiring trust and discretion. The circular logic was breathtaking. Ophelia had been discredited through whisper campaigns, and now those same whispers were being used to justify continued exclusion. Augustus found himself face to face with the exact mechanism she had described, watching it operate in real time. So the fact that powerful people destroyed her career becomes evidence that she deserved to have her career destroyed. Walsh's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That's a rather dramatic way to characterize legitimate concerns about professional competence. Is it an accurate description of how certain people get eliminated when they become inconvenient? The question hung between them like a line drawn in sand. Augustus could see Walsh recalibrating her approach, recognizing that persuasion through implication wasn't going to work, and preparing for more direct tactics. Augustus, I'm going to speak plainly. The board is concerned that your judgment may be compromised by personal feelings for this woman. That's not necessarily a criticism, these things happen. but it does raise questions about your ability to make objective decisions regarding company priorities. The accusation was delivered with surgical precision, designed to reframe his advocacy as emotional weakness rather than ethical commitment. Augustus felt the familiar pressure to defend himself, to provide reassurance that his judgment remained sound, his priorities properly aligned with corporate interests. Instead, he found himself thinking about Ophelia's description of survival versus surrender, of the choices people faced when systems demanded their silence in exchange for their security. "You're right that my judgment has been affected," he said finally. "Learning about systematic exclusion has changed how I evaluate our company's practices. If that makes me less objective about maintaining the status quo, then yes, I'm compromised." Walsh's careful composure slipped for a moment, revealing surprise at his refusal to accept the offered exit. "The board can't support initiatives that aren't based on sound business reasoning." "Then let's discuss business reasoning. We spend significant resources on diversity recruitment, but see minimal results in leadership advancement. We invest in training programs that don't change actual workplace dynamics. Either we're incompetent at implementing these initiatives, or we're avoiding the real obstacles to progress. And you think bringing in someone with a history of professional difficulties will solve these problems? I think bringing in someone who understands how exclusion operates might help us recognize why our inclusion efforts aren't working." Walsh leaned back in her chair, her expression settling into the patient resignation of someone dealing with a colleague who had become unreasonably stubborn. "Augustus, I need you to understand something. The board has invested considerable trust in your leadership over the years. That trust is based on your track record of making sound decisions that benefit the company and its stakeholders. When that judgment appears compromised, it creates complications." The threat was elegant in its subtlety, his position secure, as long as he remained aligned with board expectations, precarious if he continued pursuing uncomfortable changes. Augustus understood he was being offered a final opportunity to step back from the precipice of institutional displeasure. What kind of complications? The kind that make it difficult to maintain confidence in leadership decisions. The kind that require boards to consider whether alternative leadership might better serve company interests. The ultimatum was delivered with the same maternal concern Walsh had used to open the conversation, as if threatening someone's career was an act of kindness designed to prevent more serious consequences. Augustus felt the weight of everything he had built pressing down on him, the reputation, the financial security, the respect of peers who mattered in his professional world. Ophelia had described this moment, the choice between preservation of self and commitment to principle, that defined who people really were beneath their public presentations. "I understand your concerns, Catherine, but I'm going to move forward with the consultation. Dr. Storm deserves the opportunity to demonstrate her value without being prejudged by rumors designed to discredit her." Walsh's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by the cold assessment of someone calculating costs and benefits. "That's your final decision." "It is." She nodded, once the gesture carrying more finality than any spoken threat. "Then I suppose we'll see how that works out for everyone involved." As Augustus walked back to his office through streets where November wind cut through even expensive overcoats, he felt the peculiar lightness that came with burning bridges he hadn't realized he was still standing on. His phone buzzed with a text from Ophelia. "Dinner tonight. I could use the company." He typed back quickly. "Yes, and I could use the advice on being unemployed." Her response made him smile despite everything. "Premature. You're still employed. Just unemployable." The evening news played softly in the background of Ophelia's modest apartment, a space that reflected both intellectual curiosity and financial constraint. Books lined makeshift shelves, constructed from boards and bricks, their subjects ranging from linguistic theory to contemporary fiction, to volumes on organizational psychology that suggested ongoing study despite her changed circumstances. Augustus sat on her second-hand sofa, feeling overdressed in his tailored suit, while she moved through the small kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to find contentment within limitations. The contrast between her current situation and the life her qualifications should have afforded felt more striking in this intimate setting. "So," she said, settling beside him with 2 cups of tea, "tell me about today's casualties." Yet Augustus had spent the afternoon fielding calls from board members, expressing concern about his judgment emails, from colleagues suggesting he reconsider his position, and one particularly venomous voicemail from Thomas Meridian about the damage his recklessness might cause to company morale. The coordinated nature of the response suggested his conversation with Walsh had been immediately disseminated through appropriate channels. "They're closing ranks," he said, "making it clear that supporting you means opposing them." Ophelia nodded without surprise. "Standard playbook. Isolate the dissenter, make the cost of resistance higher than the benefit of compliance. Is that what happened to you? This kind of coordinated pressure?" "Not exactly. My situation was more surgical precision destruction rather than broad intimidation. But the underlying principle is the same. Systems protect themselves by making examples of people who threaten their stability." Augustus found himself studying her face, looking for signs of bitterness or defeat that might justify his colleague's assumption that her experiences had compromised her judgment. Instead, he saw the analytical clarity that had first attracted his attention now applied to understanding forces that had shaped her own life. "Aren't you angry about what they're doing to me, I mean? Using your past against both of us. I'm angry about what they did to me," she said carefully. "But I won't take responsibility for consequences you chose when you decided to advocate for someone the system had already rejected." The distinction felt important, though Augustus wasn't immediately sure why. Perhaps because it reflected a refusal to see herself as victim, even when discussing genuine victimization. "What would you do in my position?" Ophelia was quiet for a long moment, watching steam rise from her teacup, like incense in a temple, dedicated to difficult decisions. "That depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you want to keep your job and maintain relationships with your colleagues, you should apologize for poor judgment and withdraw the proposal. If you want to change how your company operates, you need to accept that you can't do it from inside the system that benefits from current arrangements." The assessment was delivered without emotion, as if she were analyzing a case study rather than discussing his future. "And if I want to do something about what happened to you, that's not your decision to make." The words came firmly, but not harshly. "I appreciate your support, but my story isn't yours to resolve. It's mine to decide what to do with." Augustus felt properly chastened, recognizing that his impulse to fix her situation reflected assumptions about agency and rescue that missed the point entirely. "Then, what is my decision to make? Whether you're willing to use your platform to address the same systems that hurt me, knowing they'll try to hurt you too." The phrasing crystallized something Augustus had been struggling to articulate: the difference between helping Ophelia and confronting the mechanisms that had made help necessary. "You mean going public?" "I mean deciding whether your commitment to change is stronger than your attachment to comfort." Before Augustus could respond, Ophelia's phone buzzed with a text that made her expression shift from thoughtful to alert. "What is it?" She held up the phone so he could read the message. "Dr. Storm, this is Janet Morrison from Channel 7 News. We'd like to discuss your employment history and recent interactions with Augustus Fairmont. Please call at your earliest convenience." Augustus felt his stomach drop. "How did they? Someone fed them my name," Ophelia said simply. "Probably the same people who've been researching my background for your board." The implications were immediate and threatening. Augustus could imagine the story that would emerge: successful CEO, compromised by personal involvement with disgraced former diplomat, poor judgment leading to questionable business decisions. The narrative would serve multiple purposes, discrediting his advocacy, while reinforcing doubts about Ophelia's credibility. "They're trying to destroy both of us," They're trying to control the story before it gets away from them, Ophelia corrected. The question is whether we let them. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that represented millions of people living their own complicated relationships with power and justice. There's something I haven't told you, she said without turning around, about what really happened during that negotiation. Augustus waited, sensing that whatever came next would change the trajectory of everything that followed. I recorded it, the conversation with Richard Blackwell, where he asked me to edit my translations. It's illegal to record without consent in most diplomatic contexts, but I was already suspicious about the direction things were heading. The revelation hit Augustus like electricity. You have proof. I have evidence. Whether it constitutes proof depends on who's evaluating it and what they're motivated to believe. She turned back to face him, her expression carrying the weight of decisions that had been building for 2 years. I never used it because I knew what would happen. Blackwell's people would claim the recording was edited, that I was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, that my own bias compromised my credibility as a witness. The mathematics of that fight were simple. His word against mine, his resources against mine, his reputation against mine. But now there's another voice, someone whose credibility they can't dismiss as easily, whose platform they can't ignore. Augustus understood what she was offering, not rescue, but partnership. Not salvation, but the opportunity to stand together against forces that had isolated them individually. If we do this, they'll come after us with everything they have. They're already coming after us, Ophelia pointed out. The question is whether we meet them on their terms or ours. Outside, the city continued its relentless motion, millions of stories intersecting in ways that could change everything or nothing, depending on who found the courage to speak when silence felt safer. Augustus looked at Ophelia, seeing not someone who needed saving, but someone offering to save others from the same fate she had endured. "Let's call Janet Morrison," he said. 1 year later, the same Manhattan restaurant where everything had begun hosted a different kind of gathering. The evening light struck the windows at the same angle, but the conversations filling the dining room carried new rhythms. Voices that had previously been absent from these spaces' perspectives, that had been systematically excluded from tables where decisions were made. Augustus sat at a corner table, no longer CEO of his former company, but serving as director of a non-profit, focused on workplace equity and systemic change. The transition had been brutal resignation under pressure, legal battles over severance terms, professional exile from circles that had once welcomed him unconditionally. But the work felt more substantial than anything he had accomplished in corporate boardrooms, even if the financial rewards were considerably smaller. Across from him, Ophelia reviewed notes for the evening's presentation to a coalition of business leaders, labor organizers, and civil rights advocates. The recording she had preserved for 2 years had become the centerpiece of a federal investigation into diplomatic corruption, while her analysis of institutional bias had evolved into a consulting practice that kept her calendar fuller than she could manage alone. "Nervous?" Augustus asked, noting the careful attention she was paying to her prepared remarks. "Focused," she corrected, though her smile suggested appreciation for his concern. "This audience includes some of the same people who used to cross the street to avoid acknowledging my existence." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Several board members from Augustus's former company would be present tonight, along with other corporate leaders who had initially dismissed their advocacy as misguided idealism. Recent settlements in discrimination lawsuits, combined with changing public expectations about corporate responsibility, had created new interest in perspectives they had previously rejected. "Any regrets?" he asked. Ophelia considered the question while watching the restaurant's current staff, a notably more diverse group than had been employed there a year earlier, prepare for the evening's event. "About speaking out, none. About the time it took to find my voice again." She paused, weighing words with the precision that remained her hallmark. I regret the years I spent believing that silence was safer than truth. But I understand why I made that choice. The distinction felt characteristic of how Ophelia approached most things, acknowledging complexity without excusing harm, taking responsibility without accepting blame for circumstances beyond her control. The restaurant's manager, a young black woman named Keisha, who had been promoted from server after the previous management's forced restructuring, approached their table with the confident professionalism of someone who belonged in every space she occupied. Storm, they're ready for you upstairs, whenever you'd like to begin. Thank you, Keisha. We'll be right there. As they gathered their materials, Augustus reflected on the changes that had rippled outward from their initial decision to speak publicly. The federal investigation had led to policy reforms in diplomatic hiring practices. Several corporations had implemented new accountability measures for diversity initiatives. Professional associations had established clearer protocols for addressing discrimination complaints. But the most significant change was harder to quantify: a shift in conversation that made certain forms of exclusion more difficult to maintain, certain narratives harder to sustain without challenge. The upstairs dining room was filled with an audience that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Not because the individuals were new, but because they had never been in the same space simultaneously, never been asked to consider their shared stake in addressing systemic inequities. Ophelia moved to the podium with the same quiet confidence she had displayed that first night, when she offered to translate between worlds that seemed impossibly distant from each other. But now she was translating something more complex, the experience of exclusion, into language that included people could understand the mechanics of bias, into frameworks that privileged people could recognize. A year ago, she began, many of you learned my name in the context of scandal rather than scholarship. Tonight I want to talk about why that distinction matters and what it reveals about how we decide whose knowledge has value. Then Augustus watched the audience settle into attention, recognizing faces that had once dismissed everything Ophelia represented. Some still carried skepticism in their expressions, but most seemed genuinely prepared to listen. Whether from conviction or calculation was less important than their presence. Systemic exclusion operates through seemingly neutral processes that produce consistently biased outcomes, she continued. It doesn't require malicious intent, just the absence of intentional inclusion. It doesn't demand active discrimination, just passive acceptance of discriminatory results. The analysis was vintage Ophelia, clear, precise, impossible to dismiss as emotional or unsubstantiated. Augustus had watched her refine these concepts through months of presentations to increasingly receptive audiences, transforming personal experience into institutional insight. As she spoke about translation as bridge building, about the difference between diversity and inclusion, about the relationship between individual agency and structural change. Augustus found himself thinking about the bicycle lesson they had observed months earlier. The patient teaching the willingness to run alongside someone, learning to balance the recognition that support meant knowing when to hold on and when to let go. During the question period that followed, Catherine Walsh stood to address Ophelia directly. The former board member looked older than Augustus remembered her carefully maintained composure, showing signs of genuine uncertainty. Dr. Storm, I want to acknowledge that I was wrong about your qualifications and your potential contribution to our conversations about workplace equity. I'm wondering what advice you would give to organizations trying to move beyond good intentions toward meaningful change. The apology was more than Augustus had expected, though he recognized it as strategic as much as sincere. Still, Ophelia received it with the grace she brought to most interactions, neither dismissing the gesture nor demanding greater acknowledgement. Start with listening, she said simply. Not to confirm what you already believe, but to learn what you don't yet understand. and accept that meaningful change requires sharing power, not just expressing support for it. As the evening concluded, and people began forming smaller conversation clusters, Augustus found himself standing beside the window where he had once watched pedestrians pass without wondering about their stories. The city looked the same, but his relationship to it had fundamentally shifted. Ophelia joined him at the window, both of them watching the street life below. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Beginnings," he said. "How this started with translation and somehow became about transformation. Language shapes reality," she reminded him. "Change how people talk about something, and you change how they think about it. Change how they think, and you change what becomes possible." Outside, the city continued its eternal process of reinvention, millions of individual stories combining into something larger than any single narrative could contain. "Thank you," Augustus said quietly. "For what? Teaching me to hear what I wasn't listening for." Ophelia smiled, the expression carrying acknowledgement of how far they had both traveled from that first moment, when she had offered to help bridge a gap that had seemed unbridgeable. "That's what translation is," she said, "making understanding possible between people who speak different languages." Below them, the streetlights illuminated pathways that led in every direction toward futures that remained unwritten, but no longer seemed impossible to imagine.